Okay, perfect. So thank you for being here, online or in person. Today, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce you Onerva. Onerva, she's a good friend of mine, and you will see the talk will be, I think it will be interesting. So she has a PhD in computational sciences. She's from Finland, as you can see, from the Aalto University. And after her PhD, she had several postdocs positions, first in Aalto, secondly in Lille, then you went to Madrid.
Yeah.
So as you can see, she was following a gradient of temperature from colder places to warmer one. And I don't know why she is here in Palma. I don't know why. So, and the talk will be about brain functional networks. I know that some of you work with brains, and I think most of you or many of you work with network. But if there is something that is very specific of Onerva is that she questions everything. So it's not that she will accept just something as a fact. She wants to double check it and she wants to know more about things. So probably at the end, you will have doubts about what a network is or if networks are out there or something like that. So if you work with network, brace yourself. Okay, thank you, Onerva.
Thanks for the introduction. It's cool to be, it's not actually cool to be here. It's rather hot to be here, but nice to be here anyways. And yeah, as Massimiliano said, I'm Onerva, working currently as a postdoc in Aalto University, Finland, in the Complex Networks Research Group, together with Professor Jari Saramäki. And before I forget, my work is funded by the Academy of Finland, so great thanks to the Academy. And I will today talk about brain networks. The talk sort of divides into three parts. So I will first try to convince you about the brain, maybe not being a network, but at least being worth of being studied as a network. So a bit about why the brain is a network. Then a bit more about how to construct brain networks and what are the common problems. And then I will close with some more general thoughts about what is actually a network and what is not a network, and does it make sense to study networks at all. So I don't know if you believe in brain networks now and won't believe in brain networks in 45 minutes. I'm sorry for that. Let's get started. So, oh yeah, couple of things. The slides, they are available online. So there's the address, and it will appear again in the last slide. So in case you, after the talk, still feel that you want to have a look at the slides. I'm happy to take questions also in the middle of the talk, if you have anything in mind. Y pues supongo que puedo tomar preguntas en español también, si alguien siente mejor hablando español. Voin vastata suomeksikin, jos joku puhuu suomea, niin sekin käy. So let's get started. So why would the brain be a network? Basically, when I go to visit basic schools and ask the kids about the brain, what do you know about the brain? The first thing they tell is that, yeah, brain is located inside the head. That is, of course, right. And the second thing is that the brain consists of neuronal cells, the neurons, and that is sort of the basic level of knowledge of the brain we need today as well. So the brain consists of neurons. They are around 10 to the 11th altogether, and they are connected by synapses, around 10 to the 14th synapses altogether. And what actually happens at the level of neurons and synapses is that they do form networks, concrete, real networks that can be observed. The picture here is from, am I actually standing right in front of the picture? I'll go here. Better. So the picture is from the work by some colleagues in Madrid, where they studied the neurons of grasshoppers, and they are actually so large that one can see them with a normal light microscope. So what they did was basically that they had a thin slice of the brain tissue or neuronal tissue of the grasshopper. They removed from it all connections between the neurons and just left it in the liquid for a couple of days, observing what happens. And what happened was that here in the first day, they basically have separated neurons. Then some days after, the neurons start to grow axon bundles. So they really, really try to connect. And in day 6, you can already see that there are quite a bit of connections between the neurons, and also those neurons that are not able to connect die out. And in day 12, day 14, that is around the time the neurons stay alive in the liquid. So in around day 12, you can already see a complex network that shows the properties you would expect. For example, it's small world and it's scale free and has some clustering, has some communities. So the neurons, to stay alive, they actually do need to form networks. That is the basic idea behind of the brain being a network. Now, by the way, I won't define what is a network. I assume everybody here knows more or less what is a network. If somebody doesn't, then please ask. So this is the level of neurons. There the brain is actually a network. And there are further evidence from large-scale brain networks. Basically, if you measure what happens in the brain of the subject while doing some complicated or less complicated cognitive task, you see that multiple brain areas need to activate at the same time or following each other in a certain order in order to perform the task. So there are hints about brain being sort of networked system also in the level higher than the one of neurons. So this is the motivation why we would study the brain as a network. And the field I'm working in, it's called network neuroscience. That is a rather new name, rather new field. When I started my PhD in 2014, my field didn't actually have a name. So I used to call it a corner of network science that studies the brain, or computational neuroscience using network tools, or something like that. In 2016, there was the paper by Danny Bassett and Sarah Maldon that actually first used the term network neuroscience. And 1 year later, 2017 came out the paper actually defining the field. So the Bassett and Spohn's network neuroscience paper. And simply put, network neuroscience applies network tools to understand the brain. Often we say to understand the human brain, but there are also people working on monkeys, on mice, on fruit flies even, and on grasshoppers. And the field has, roughly speaking, 2 different aims. And these 2 aims are actually important later on when we start talking about what is actually a network. So first of all, we try to understand how does the healthy human brain work? Which are the features of the brain that explain its function? And then on the other hand, we try to understand what goes wrong when a patient gets ill. So basically, what is the reason behind different brain diseases, different brain illnesses, and how they could be treated? So these are the two aims of the field. The field, as it defines itself, has a huge variation of scales. These are the spatial scales. So basically, as you all know, when we have more information, then so basically, if we have more data, more information, we are here in this end. So we know things in very much detail, but the whole thing is also very complicated and hard to analyze. And then when we start moving towards more simple models, then we lose data, lose detail. So basically the smallest scales, spatially in network neuroscience, are here. They are inside the cells. So we are talking about things that are smaller than neurons, some sort of chemistry happening inside the cells. And there are some people that define that also as network neuroscience. Then we have the networks of the cells, as we have seen. So around 10 to 11 neurons. Then there are the and these are things that can't be analyzed, for example, in human beings, because you can imagine, you just can't image, you can't get data from those 10 to 11 neurons. And even if you could, you can't build a computational model where you would have 10 to 11 nodes connected by 10 to 14 synapses and actually doing something. Oh, well, you look suspicious, maybe you can. So then what is typically done in the case of human neuroscience, especially, we accept losing some detail, getting a bit more simplified model, and work in the mesoscale, where we have the data points. This is the level of non-invasive human neuroimaging. So basically the data we get is around 10,000 data points per subject from the brain. And these can be, I'll talk a bit about the measurement model, modulities later on, but practically these data points can be voxels in fMRI, source points in inverse modeled MEHC or EHC. Or then another way to get to the mesoscale is basically to use animal models. So then you try to use something that is not human, that has a simple neuronal system to understand the brain of the human. A typical example is the C. elegans, of course. So C. elegans has 300 and some neurons that can be actually fully modeled as a network. But of course, it's far from the complexity of the human brain. And then, especially if working with neuroscientists who actually want to do their programming in MATLAB, you need to simplify even more. They think a 10,000 times 10,000 matrix is terribly big. So then what is actually typically done is that people build macroscale models. So these would be networks of brain areas, around a couple of hundreds brain areas per network, which is a huge simplification, thinking that we originally had the 10 to 11 neurons. And then there's even scales beyond brain areas. So they are basically a thing called multi-person neuroscience, where you image the brain of, for example, two people having some sort of interaction and try to see what sort of coupling there is between the different people. And temporally, the scales range from milliseconds, that is the communication between neurons, up to hours. Basically, if you have different tasks, there can be changes happening at the scale of hours. If you study, for example, learning, there can be changes happening at the level of weeks, months, and then also there are changes happening at the temporal scale of the human lifespan. So basically, for example, some sort of maturation or aging or changes related to some illness. So this is the sort of idea what all we need to fit under the umbrella of network neuroscience, or what all people are trying to fit there. And in network neuroscience, we typically talk about three different types of brain networks. We have the structural networks that are probably the easiest to understand. So a structural brain network is a network where the links are actually something you can touch. They are typically action bundles. If you say that there's a structural connection between two areas, there's actually something that connects them. Then there are the functional networks, and for the rest of the talk, I will talk mostly about the functional networks. They are networks of temporal co-activation, so basically correlation networks. And finally, there is the third class, the effective networks that aim to be Gaussian models of actual interactions. So they are sort of models explaining the functional networks. But today I will concentrate on the functional ones. And I promise to say a couple of words about how we collect the data. Actually, we don't collect the data. I'm very grateful for anybody who does collect data for me, because I don't do that myself. We use mostly open data, and then we also have collaborators in the neuroscience department who do measuring for us. So I mostly work with fMRI, the functional magnetic resonance imaging data, and that is data that is collected by the fMRI device, that is the tube thingy, as you probably all know. You can see the corner of our fMRI there. And the idea is that there is a strong magnetic field, and then in the brain we have blood, and blood either has O2 or doesn't have O2, and depending on the level of O2, the magnetic properties of the hemoglobin differ. So basically, the hemoglobin behaves differently in the strong magnetic field, depending if it's oxygenated or not. And that's how we can localize areas that had a lot of O2, and then we can suppose that, okay, because brain function requires a lot of O2, probably these areas that had a lot of it were active. So fMRI is an indirect measure of the brain activity. And as I already mentioned, the measurement unit is voxel. Voxel is basically a 3D pixel, so a small cube of the brain matter. And depending a bit on the protocol, but typically in an fMRI measurement, we have around 10,000 voxels per brain, maybe a bit more if the resolution is particularly good. In general, people say that the spatial resolution of fMRI is good, so we get to the level of millimeters, which is of course huge compared to neurons, but still rather nice, so you can see brain structures. The temporal resolution is a mess, so it's at the level of seconds, half a second at the best. So we don't actually see any real activation of neurons, we just see some sort of follow-up effects of the neuronal activity. The another main source of data are the electrophysiological measurements, MEHC, that is magnetoencephalography, and EEG, electroencephalography. And these might be more familiar to at least some of you. They are basically based on the fact that when neurons interact, they do that electrically. So basically, there are electrical fields in the brain, and then there are magnetic fields induced by those electrical fields. And those fields are measured, the magnetical ones by MEHC, the electric ones by EEG. And of course, we again don't see the fields of single neurons, but merely the fields of some sort of clusters of neurons doing the same thing at the same time. Opposite to fMRI, MEHC and EEG are so-called direct measurements, so you actually measure activation of neurons. When you measure, you typically get the data from outside of the head, so you have the electrodes or the magnetometers. And then if you actually want to localize the data on the brain surface, you need to bring in some sort of inverse model. I'm not going into details of inverse modeling, but it's basically transforming the field you see outside the head into actual electrical sources inside of the head. And temporal resolution is excellent at the level of millisecond. Spatial resolution depends hugely. If you have the electrodes, then your spatial resolution is like 10 centimeters. If you have a good inverse model, you can get down to the millimeters, so similar to fMRI, but with a lot of variance because of the problems in the inverse modeling. So this is the data we have. And how we then turn this kind of data into a network. Basically, we start from the nice fresh data from the scanner. Then, as always with data, so these are just time series. Actually, the time series I have here, they are not real brain time series. They are white noise, don't tell anybody. And some level of pre-processing is needed to clean up those time series. Then, after the pre-processing, for building a network, and this is now something that is not unique for the brain. This is something that applies to all networks built from time series. So the same recipe could be used for building time series of temperatures measured at networks of temperatures measured at different places on Earth, or networks of prices in stock, or networks of air quality, or whatever. So basically, you need to have a definition of 4 nodes. That is complicated, and I'm getting back to it. Typically, the node definition includes some level of coarse graining. So basically, you are collapsing the data points somehow together and averaging their time series to manage the system, to manage the big number of data points you have. After the coarse graining, you need a definition for links. In case of time series, there is always a measure of similarity. And in case of brain data, there is almost always Pearson correlation, especially in fMRI. In MEHC and EEG, there are different kind of phase similarity measures that are also used. Then you have the nodes, and then you have a definition for the links. You can calculate the similarity matrix between nodes. So this guy here, and that is already a network. It's a full network, and typically you want to threshold it somehow. Of course, you can't really do a lot with a full network. So you apply thresholding, practically throw away those links that are not really significant or are very weak, and then the outcome of the thresholding is actually a brain network. I will today mostly concentrate on the node definition, just to give you quick pointers. The pre-processing part has been studied a lot, and I have worked on that myself. There are a lot of steps that affect the structure of the networks we construct. So basically, what you do in pre-processing affects what sort of network measures you get. We have especially studied spatial smoothing, so basically averaging the voxel time series to get rid of noise. That is rather bad for networks in a very brief summary. And right now we are investigating the effect of a very common pre-processing step, transformation to the standard space. And that seems to be bad for networks as well. But that's ongoing. I don't have any results about that yet. Another thing that has been studied a lot is the link definition. I said that it's almost always a Pearson correlation in fMRI. It could be also a partial correlation or some more advanced method. And for example, I'm actually involved in 2 projects about which I don't know if they really exist, but both of them are about constructing brain networks with somehow Bayesian links that are somehow defined in Bayesian sense, or links that are somehow probabilistic. And that would probably be better from the network viewpoint, giving more, let's say, accurate network descriptions, but the computational cost easily gets huge. But today I'll concentrate on node definition. And so why we want to talk about node definition? Above the scale of neurons, we don't have any natural candidates. We don't know how to define the nodes. And that means that the number of nodes in the literature changes a lot. However, for almost 20 years, it has been known that how you define the nodes affects the network properties. So this actually really matters, and the field would need a standard way to define the nodes. The common strategies for defining nodes include using the data points, so using the voxels or using the MEG source points, or using some sort of random regions, so random clumps of voxels or vertices, or then using regions of interest, ROIs. They are collections of voxels or source points defined in terms of anatomy. So between this sulcus and that gyrus, we have an ROI, or in terms of function, these voxels are doing the same thing, so they should form an ROI, or even in terms of connectivity, these guys connect in a similar way to the rest of the brain, so they should form an ROI. And what follows is all from fMRI. So basically the biggest difference between voxels and ROIs as nodes is that there are more voxels than ROIs. Voxels are the imaging resolution. Their time series are assumed to be noisy, and they are indeed around 10,000, which means large computational load. ROIs are collections of voxels. Independently of how they are defined, they are assumed to be homogeneous, meaning that every voxel in the same ROI does more or less the same thing at the same time. And because of that, it is thought that the voxel time series inside an ROI can be safely averaged to obtain a time series for the ROI. And now the question is, how violent is that averaging? How much data we actually lose? So this is now stuff from my PhD. We actually wanted to check how much we lose when averaging. And to this end, we defined a simple measure for homogeneity, spatial consistency, which is just simply the mean Pearson correlation coefficient between voxel time series in the same ROI. It's pretty straightforward to calculate, not too expensive to calculate, and very easy to interpret. So basically, if you have spatial consistency of 1, that means that you have a perfect ideal ROI, the one we are all dreaming about. If you have a spatial consistency of 0, it means that you have a collection of random time series, and you should definitely average them. The picture shows spatial consistency for 3 commonly used sets of ROIs. In all those sets, we have some ROIs that are good, but we have some that are really bad, and the most typical consistency value is somewhere around 0.2. So that much about the homogeneity assumption. We have also seen that the consistency correlates with the size of the ROI and also with the connectivity of the ROI. And now the latest news are that not only there is low Pearson correlation coefficient between voxels, but also there are no higher order similarities either. So this is actually the reason why I'm here. This is what we have been doing. And Massimiliano kindly passed this pic to my secretary, that is my wife, who happens to have mobile internet on her phone, unlike I do. What we see here is basically Massimiliano has been calculating the identifiability between time series. So basically a measure for how well a deep learner can tell apart time series from each other. And the results show that practically the time series that are inside same ROIs are almost as different from each other than time series that are in different ROIs. So there's no hidden higher order similarity inside ROIs either. Now then, I said there's a connection between consistency or homogeneity and the connectivity. What we did here was that we have on x-axis the mean consistency of a pair of ROIs. So let's imagine we have an ROI here and another one up there. And on the y-axis, we have the link weight between the ROIs. And in the voxel case, yeah.
So could you repeat what was consistency?
Consistency, yeah, it's this thing here. So it's the mean Pearson correlation between voxel time series inside the ROI. Yeah. So basically telling how similar are the voxels in here to each other. In the voxel case, so in here, the link weight is the average correlation between voxels in here and voxels in there. So average of these links in the middle. And what we see there is that the strongest links we have, these in here, I hope you can see them, are between those ROIs that are the most consistent. And particularly, we don't see any links up here. So no links between ROIs that are not consistent. In the case of ROIs here, the link weight is the correlation between the ROI time series. So the correlation between averages of voxel time series. And what we see here is a big bunch of links between ROIs that are not consistent to start with. And now the question is, how should we interpret a correlation between average of something that is not correlated and average of something else that is not correlated either? My interpretation is that these are spurious links. Now we asked, but why do we have such a low consistency in ROIs? There are practically two possible explanations. Another one, or the first one, would be that the ROIs are just badly defined. If we move them a bit, define them spatially differently, they would be better. And the another option is that actually their consistency changes in time. So that there are some moments where they are consistent, other moments where they are not at all. And then when you calculate the overall consistency across the whole time you get something mediate or below mediate. And that is actually the case. Here we have points corresponding to ROIs in 4 different. Actually, there are differences in consistency between different time window pairs. So we had 5 time windows altogether. And here you can see that there are some ROIs that increase in consistency, others that decrease. And this allows us to define a thing we call spatiotemporal consistency, which is a measure for the stability of spatial consistency. So sort of how homogeneous is this ROI and how homogeneous it is between different time windows. So does it have high homogeneity all the time, low all the time, or does it change from high to low? And you can see that there are regions that are pretty consistently either homogeneous or non-homogeneous, and then there are regions that change from homogeneous to non-homogeneous. Next, we zoomed in to see what happens inside the ROIs. So here we basically have 4 ROIs. The top rows are so-called good ones. So what you can see are the voxel level correlation matrices inside the ROIs. In the 2 top ones, the mean voxel level correlation is rather high. So these guys have high consistency, while the lower ones have low mean voxel level correlation, so low consistency. And practically one of these ROIs, that one, is just a bad one. The voxel level correlation inside the ROI is uniformly low all the time, nothing happens. In all the remaining ones, we see that there are modules inside the ROIs appearing and disappearing, and I still don't have strong results about this, but I assume that there might be some connection between the connectivity structure inside the ROIs and its changes in time, and on the other hand, the role the ROI plays in the brain network. And we do have some preliminary results about this. So basically, we calculated a bunch of measures of the internal connectivity structure, what sort of modules there are, how uniform are the voxel level correlations, and try to use those to predict the role of the ROI. So basically to predict if our ROI is a hub or non-hub, and then among the hubs, if it's a connector hub, so basically building bridges between different parts of the network, or if it's a local or provincial hub, only having like short distance connections. In the hub versus non-hub prediction, so what we have here, what we have here on the left, we are not perfect at all, but we are still safely above the random classification, so around 60. And in particular, we see that the ROIs that have high spatial consistency tend to be hubs. In the provincial versus connector hub case, on the other hand, honestly speaking, we are not that much above the random classification. So there might be something, but we may not have catched it yet. And actually, the student who did these predictions for me, Elisa Ryyppö, said that this might be, of course, it might be that there is just nothing to be found, but it might also be that the predictor we are using here, which is just linear regression, might be too simple. So we are digging deeper into it, so to speak. But there's still some sort of connection between what happens inside ROIs and how the ROIs link to each other. And of course, we have been thinking about possible solutions then. If we know that our ROIs are not homogeneous, if we average voxel time series, we lose data all the time and may actually end up having spurious links. So what we have thought about is that could we do this better? And this is now ongoing work with Tarmo Nurmi, Maria Hakonen, who collected the data, Iiro Jääskeläinen, who coordinated the data collection, and Mikko Kivelä, whom you probably know by name, the multi-layer guy. And this based on the multi-layer networks. So the idea would be to construct the brain networks so that we have layers corresponding to the time windows. Inside each layer, we would define the ROIs so that they are optimized for homogeneity, so that they have as high consistency as possible. And this is basically where we are stuck now, because this is a clustering problem. And if you have ever worked with community detection or clustering, you know that that is hard. So there we are now. When we have done that, we would like to build the links inside layers as normal similarity, probably Pearson correlation coefficient between the ROIs, and the links between the layers as overlap. So basically, for example, here you would say that, okay, the blue guy is more or less the same here and also here. So there's a strong link between the layers. On the other hand, here something happens, the blue guy almost disappears, so there's only a very weak link. So that is the model we are constructing. And whenever we have it ready, we would like to ask things like, how do the ROIs change in time? Do they split? Do they merge? Do they disappear? Do they reappear? And does that happen randomly? Or is there some sort of systemacy behind it? So could we spot time points where everything changes, and could we possibly call that a state change? And then specifically, we have data about patients with Alzheimer's diagnosis and controls. So of course, we would like to see are the changes different in the patients than in the controls. So this is actually now the brain network part. And what will follow now, I still have some time. I must say we didn't start at past, so so now I'm going to talk about something a bit more general. And that is a thing that I call not all that glitters is a network. This is very important in network neuroscience, I think. But I think this applies to other fields of network science as well. I mean, if you have ever given a lecture about network science to university students or to kids in basic school or to the general public, you probably have started with networks are everywhere around us and we can apply the same model to explain power grids and social relationships and the brain and this and that and the flights and whatnot. I have done that. And that is true and that is cool. But at the same time, I think we are a bit carried away by the beautiful generalizability of our model. And we sort of start thinking that actually everything we see is a network. So basically, sort of trying to manage this problem of things being networks or maybe not being networks, I have defined a space spanned by two questions. Is a system a network? And should it be studied as a network? By a system being a network, I mean that networkiness is a fundamental feature of the system. The system essentially consists of nodes and links. And when I discussed this with Jari Saramäki, he came up with the definition of a fundamental network having nodes and links you can actually put your finger on. So for example, if you have a road network, you can put your finger on the roads, they really do exist. And if you define that the nodes are, for example, cities, you can really touch them and say that, yeah, they exist. There are also cases where you can't really. I'll show some examples in a minute. And then independently of this dimension, there's the question, should our system be studied as a network? And this means that if a system should be studied as a network, the network model as a tool gives some useful information about the system. It may or may not actually explain the fundamental nature of the system, but it should give something useful. For example, it should help us build nicer cities to live in, or it should help us to avoid delays in our flights, or it should help us to cure brain diseases. So that sort of thing is the practical dimension. As a network scientist, it is of course easy for me to come up with examples of systems that are networks and should be studied as networks. All mathematical network models, of course, belong here. The Edelsremy network, for example. The World Wide Web is quite a typical example. Actually, yes, it is a network. I don't know if anybody has modeled it as anything else than a network mathematically. And then we also have the social relationships where it's pretty clear that, yeah, we have the people, they are the nodes, and then there are connections between them. And if we have social relationships and want to study them, we can't explain them practically by anything else but connections between people. So there are systems that are definitely networks and that probably should also be studied as networks. The network model definitely produces useful information. As an example of systems that may not actually be networks, but can still be studied as such, I have considered textual documents. So basically you can build networks of documents, for example, by the co-appearance of certain words or certain expressions. And those can be used to study, for example, structures in administration or policy. So network analysis can yield useful information, but still I wouldn't say a textual document or even a pile of textual documents is actually a network. Then the difficult corner, not a network and probably shouldn't be studied as such, is, for example, single body movement. If you have a body moving somewhere in space, probably you merely apply, I don't know, Newtonian physics and not network analysis. And my example for it is a network, but probably shouldn't be studied as one, is multi-body movement. And I have always thought that some sort of statistical mechanics would be better approach than networks. But actually now in the Complex Systems Conference, in the last keynote, there was a network study of 3 pendulums. And now I don't know anymore if this example applies. It might be that we actually should study multi-body movement as networks. But so these the field like or the space, are things networks, should they be studied as networks? And I think every time when we start studying a system, we should ask, where is our system in this space? So where is the brain? What follows is a brief recap of the history of network neuroscience starting from the 19th century. So here we have the famous guys, Joseph von Gerlach and Camillo Golgi. Sorry for the bad pronunciation of their names. They were guys who studied the brain before the neurons were found. And the theory they were supporting was called the reticulum theory. So they had the idea that the brain is sort of a crypt or sort of a web of continuous matter without separate cells. It was sort of like a ball of wool, or it was a system that is all links and no nodes. So it is actually a network, sort of, there are links, but it was never studied as a network. Then the neurons were discovered by Santiago Ramón y Cajal, and there was possibility towards the is network and should be studied as a network direction. His drawings, these that everybody probably has seen, they actually look like network diagrams. there could have been rise for network neuroscience already back then. But instead what happened Brodmann and others. So people started doing the amazing work of detecting areas with different types of cells with microscope. In the peak you have Brodmann and Cecil and Oskar Vogt and others in Berlin around 1900, and then of course a drawing of the Brodmann areas. So they actually went to the other extreme. The brain is a collection of independent areas that are different in terms of cell types and also in terms of function, and they definitely shouldn't be studied as a network. At least they never were. Before then 60s, when White and others published the original C. elegans paper, mapping the neuronal system of C. elegans, that was for a long time the first network representation of a neuronal system. That was the step towards, okay, it is actually a network direction. And then in early 2000s, there were Spons and Hackman who introduced the concept of connectomics, mapping the structural connections in the brain in the format of a network. And as I already told later on, the rise of axial network neuroscience by Bassett and Muldoon and Spons. That is where we are now, but what puzzles my mind is this. I have shown that we don't know how to define the nodes. They are definitely not such that you could put your finger on them and say that this is a node. There are problems defining the links. In functional brain networks, links surely are something that doesn't exist. We don't know what is the axial connection between brain structure and brain function. And in case of functional brain networks, there's a huge problem in interpretation of the results, because we all know the links are correlation. They don't indicate causation. If you open a functional brain network paper, it talks about information exchange, information flow, collaboration, interaction. So they are full of Gaussian terminology. And I think that is really a problem in the field, that we build one thing and then we interpret it as another thing. But so I just want to leave you the space. So next time you are going to construct a network, think for a while if you are here. So if your network analysis actually touches the fundamentals of the system, or if you are merely here, so maybe you are not explaining the very nature of the system, but still getting out something useful. I suppose none of you is actually here trying to build a network on something that definitely is not. So to conclude, network neuroscience applies network methods to study the brain. And if you remember one thing from this talk, remember that constructing a functional brain network is not trivial. You can have problems with nodes, links, pre-processing, thresholding. I didn't talk about thresholding, but that's tricky as well. And also interpretation of the results. So if you want to construct a brain network, know your methods, know how they affect your results, and also know your questions and don't overinterpret. Specifically, definition of nodes is difficult. The nodes currently used are all non-homogeneous. Sorry if any one of you has defined the parcellation of ROIs. Your ROIs are bad. This may affect, or this does affect the connectivity, the networks we observe. We don't know exactly how it affects. And further, we know that homogeneity changes in time, possibly changes related to brain function, and flexible time-dependent nodes defined differently in different time windows might be a solution. And then finally, I think not everything that glitters is a network, and we need to think if the system we are about to study is. So what we need here is some critical thinking before applying any analysis, and also critical discussion. That's where we close. This is a terrible list of references. This should feature every paper that was mentioned in the slides. It's here just because if you want to check it later, you can find it. Now, thank you. Time for questions and comments.
Thank you, Onerva. I have to admit that actually, yeah, I started my lecture saying, yeah, networks are everywhere and you can model everything with a network. So not a good start. Okay, time for questions. We can start from here. Okay, and then we go on.
Thank you for the talk. I guess how you constructed these Royce elements were from data coming from resting state, I guess.
Yeah.
Subject measuring during the resting state. So your definition of the ROIs would also depend on the task, because if you are doing a certain task, the activation will be different. So I thought, I'm not an expert on that, but I thought that the ROIs were defined more in terms of structural connectivity than functional, because of these changes in the activity of the areas with task, in time, everything is changing. So, but you are trying to define something dynamically, eh?
Yeah, so there were actually multiple questions. Yes, actually the ROIs we are trying to define in the multi-layer model. We have tried resting state, but also a naturalistic stimulus where the subjects are reading to a story. Listening to a story. And that is not exactly similar to resting state, but similar in that sense that there is a continuous stimulus, but no rapid changes, no block design. So we have like long time series. Almost surely there would be differences in ROIs between tasks, and there actually is a paper by Irayi and others, if I remember correctly, where they did cluster brain activity between different tasks, and they were able to use the clustering, which is basically ROIs, to predict what task the subject was doing. So yes, there are huge differences. And the structural ROIs are indeed more stable than the functional ones. The problem is that they are mostly based on post-mortem analysis. So not even like imaging, not even structural imaging, but post-mortem analysis, or then they are based on structural imaging, some sort of diffusion tensor imaging. But even there you need a professional, typically a physician, to actually do the puzzlation. So it's very, very labor intensive. Somebody needs to manually do that. And that's why they are based on either brains of single people, that is the case of postmortem studies, or on very small samples. So you might have, for example, 10 brains divided into ROIs by an expert or a group of experts. And the problem is that although that is a perfect parcellation for those 10 subjects, then because there's a lot of variation in the brain structure between different individuals, might well be that that parcellation doesn't generalize nicely to somebody else. Especially since, for example, the postmortem studies are of course such that the volunteers who kindly donated their brain tend to be elderly, because we need to wait them to die for natural causes or whatever. So it might well be that their brain structure doesn't nicely match the one of younger people. On the other hand, if we have volunteers participating in imaging studies, they are often university students. Of course, we advertise at the universities, please come. So we have a lot of students. So then if we have a parcellation based on a sample of diffusion tensor imaging, for example, it might be that they are all physics major students, white, male, 25 years. And that on the other hand doesn't generalize nicely to, I don't know, an elderly lady of Asian origin. A special difficulty is that it's very hard to construct atlases or parcellations or sets of ROIs for kids, because the brain of a kid or adolescent is so different from that of an adult.
So in short, we need the young brains.
Yeah.
Students who are here, maybe you want to volunteer. More questions?
I don't understand really the insistence in, or the importance in having homogeneous regions, homogeneous ROI. Why is this important? I'm not an homogeneous object. I have a brain, a liver, a stomach, but I can consider to be a person that can interact with other people, and then at this higher level, I can be considered an object interacting. In the brain, is this important really to have regions homogeneous, or perhaps one should be careful to distinguish that at every level that you will have a different connectivity experiencing different things? I'm just improvising, but my question is it really important to have homogeneous regions? Why?
There's basically the technical part and then more like philosophical part. Let's start from the practical part. Practically, it is important because practically what we do is that we construct the network so that first we take the time series of all voxels divide them into ROIs, and inside each ROI we average the voxel time series. So then if the time series we average are very different, then the average time series is not very meaningful. And then when we construct the network by correlating the average time series, we might be actually correlating averages that don't carry much information, which means that the overall network structure might be more or less random. So that is the technical part. And then using your metaphor of the body being non-homogeneous, that is right. And that applies to the brain as well, in that sense that there are different areas in the brain. But also in the case of the body, there is, for example, the liver, and the liver is sort of homogeneous as an organ. And then there is the brain that is also homogeneous. And I think the body works better if all the liver is liver, and all the kidneys are kidneys, and all the brain is brain, and all the blood is blood, and not so that you would have, for example, something that is 40% liver and 15% kidney and a bit of brain added. So that is sort of the idea. And then there is the fundamental question, does the brain actually have areas? Which is something I really don't know. I mean, I know we can see that during certain studies, there are clubs of multiple voxels activating to perform a task. So in that sense, yes, but are these areas stable? I really don't know. Actually, I don't believe.
More questions here? I actually have a question or more a thought about the fact that you mentioned at the end that the criteria to select whether we should study something as a network or not is not just the structure of the system, which is not that relevant, but whether we can get new information from the network or from this network representation.
Yeah.
So the usefulness of the network representation, defining usefulness as whatever. Then the natural question that I will follow is, okay, we can check if ROIs and all these network things that we do in the brain is useful or not. This can be a criteria to decide if we have to use network or not. But then the second iteration above beyond that will be, okay, let's suppose that I have an atlas and I have a given definition of ROIs. Maybe this definition should change depending on the condition that we are studying, because maybe one is more useful in one situation than in another.
Yeah.
So we could go to a situation in which we have atlases by conditions, like if you want to check Alzheimer, use this atlas. If you want to check something else, use this.
I could imagine that. I mean, practically that would mean that, for example, you have a certain atlas that yields high prediction accuracy for classifying patients with Alzheimer apart from subjects. And of course, then, if your aim is actually, for example, come up with a biomarker for early Alzheimer, which would be super cool, because in case of Alzheimer, the earlier you can start the interventions, the earlier you can start the medication, the higher is the probability that the patient actually has high quality life years. Well, then, it would be reasonable to use an atlas specialized for Alzheimer. And if that atlas is not useful for classifying, I don't know, schizophrenia, then you wouldn't use it there. So that is, when I said that network neuroscience has those two aims, like understanding the healthy brain and then finding ways to treat illnesses, I think these actually quite nicely correspond to the two axles. So basically understanding, is it a network, and then treating diseases with useful information from network studies. So I could imagine there being different atlases for different cases. Yes.
That will be computationally intensive, let's say.
It would.
And we will need a lot of brains again. We need brains. So do we have any online questions from the online audience? If so, please unmute yourself and we should be able to listen to you. Otherwise, I guess not. Any additional question here? No, okay. Then we thank you again for your talk.
So I think I can read this. So you will just be in Zoom forever.
If you close that one, then it's clear to me.
I cannot reach it. Stupid.